Ronan's first sensation was pain. A dull burning ache coiled in his ribs, spreading through his body like fire. His head throbbed, heavy with the scent of damp stone, and something richer, something dark and sweet that made his breath hitch. He opened his eyes. The room was shadowed, lit only by the silver glow filtering through an arched window. The air was cold, but not empty. She was there. Kneeling beside him, a woman watched him with an intensity that made his pulse hammer. Moonlight spilled over her skin, pale as ivory, flawless as if carved by ancient hands. Her hair, long and flowing like strands of midnight, cascaded over her shoulders, framing a face so exquisite it made his chest tighten. But it was her eyes that held him prisoner, silver, shimmering, unearthly. They flickered with curiosity, with something deep and unreadable. Her delicate fingers hovered just above his bare chest, tracing the air above his scars, as if memorizing them without daring to touch. A low growl rumbled in his throat. His body tensed, his instincts bristling between fight and something far more dangerous. She should not be this close. She should not be looking at him like that. He moved, fast as a breath, seizing her wrist before she could retreat. She did not flinch. A lesser creature would have. Instead, she tilted her head, her lips curving. Amused, intrigued, fearless. Awake so soon. Her voice was like silk woven with shadows, smooth, slow, meant to lure men to their ruin. His grip tightened. Where am I? Something flickered in her gaze. She leaned closer, too close, her cool breath teasing against his skin. Somewhere you should not be. His body ached, but he ignored it. His senses, sharpened, primal, were filled with her. Her scent, her presence, the way her fingers, still captured in his grasp, felt impossibly delicate yet carried the promise of something lethal. He bared his teeth. Who are you? Her smile deepened. Daring, dangerous, Celine. The name curled around him, unfamiliar yet instantly unforgettable. She moved then, swift and graceful, slipping free of his grasp without effort. She did not step back. No, she stayed within his reach, as if daring him to try again. Her gaze flickered down, lingering on the raw wounds across his chest and arms. You should be dead. Her voice was softer now, almost thoughtful, almost regretful. Ronan smirked, dark and feral, disappointed. Celine's silver eyes gleamed. Curious. She reached out, slower this time, testing him. He let her fingertips ghost over his skin, light as a whisper, cold as the night itself. A strange sensation rippled through him, something that was neither warmth nor chill, but something in between, something forbidden. His blood stirred, his hunger rising, not for food, not for battle, but for her. It was madness. A vampire and a werewolf, two beings never meant to exist in the same breath, let alone like this, watching, waiting, drawn into something neither could control. His jaw clenched. You should be afraid of me. Her laughter was soft, wicked. Should I? His vision darkened, his instincts screaming. She was a predator, a creature of moonlight and death. And yet something about the way she stood there, unshaken by his presence, made him want to chase her, catch her, consume her. His hands flexed against the cold stone beneath him. Not yet. Celine's smile remained, knowing and unreadable. Rest, wolf. You are not ready to leave. He watched as she turned, moving with the kind of grace that should not exist in this world. The scent of her lingered, an intoxicating ghost in the air. As the heavy door closed behind her, Ronan exhaled slowly. He was still a prisoner. But for the first time in his life, he did not know whether he wanted to escape. Ronan paced the length of his prison, muscles coiled with tension. His body ached, wounds closing too slowly, his strength flickering like dying embers. Silver, they had laced his injuries with it, burning him from the inside. He should have been dead, but he wasn't. And it had everything to do with her. Celine. The vampire had left him hours ago, yet her presence still clung to the room, saturating the air with something dark and intoxicating. Her scent, a mix of moonlit frost and something richer, something forbidden, was embedded in his senses, in his lungs, in his very blood. He hated it. He wanted more of it. His hands curled into fists. She had studied him like a scholar fascinated by a caged beast, watching, touching, teasing. Yet beneath her composed, haunting beauty, he had seen something else. Hunger, caution, a secret she wasn't ready to name. And neither was he. The door creaked. Ronan turned sharply, muscles tensing, breath steadying into something slow, deliberate, predatory. She stood in the doorway, watching him. The candlelight kissed her skin, pale as frozen silk, making her glow with an unnatural beauty. She had changed, now dressed in a flowing, obsidian gown, its fabric sliding over her curves like liquid night. A high slit revealed the delicate shape of her leg, a contrast to her deadly stillness. She looked untouchable. He wanted to touch her anyway. "You should be resting," she murmured, stepping forward with effortless grace. His jaw clenched. "You should have let me die." She tilted her head, studying him with that same unreadable expression. Amusement, intrigue, regret. He couldn't tell. "I don't know why I saved you." Her voice was calm, smooth, but there was something just beneath it. A hesitation, a truth she didn't want to admit. Ronan took a step closer. So did she. It was reckless. They both knew it. "Lies," he murmured, low and rough. Her lips curved, not quite a smile, more like a secret she wasn't ready to share, perhaps. He closed the distance between them, slow but deliberate. She didn't retreat. Instead, she lifted her chin, her silver eyes gleaming with something both challenging and inviting. "Do you know what they'll do if they find me here?" His voice dropped to a whisper, dark and dangerous. Her fingers trailed along the edge of the table beside her, a touch so delicate, so lethal, it made his pulse spike. "Do you know what they'll do if they find me helping you?" He exhaled sharply. A dangerous game, a fatal game. And yet, neither of them stepped away. The silence stretched between them, thick with tension, thick with something neither should acknowledge. A werewolf and a vampire. A beast and a ghost. Then she moved. Not away, closer. Her fingers ghosted over his chest, tracing the barely healed scars. Cold against heat, soft against unyielding strength. His body reacted instantly, muscles tightening beneath her touch, hunger curling in his stomach like a caged beast. Her gaze lifted to his, unblinking, unwavering. "Your heart is racing." Ronan caught her wrist, firm but careful, his thumb pressing against the delicate bones. "So is yours." A pause. Then the barest whisper of a laugh. She didn't deny it. For a moment, the world outside this room, the war between their kinds, the blood feuds, the inevitable betrayal, did not exist. It was just them, trapped between what they were and what they could never be. Then, with slow, deliberate grace, Celine pulled her hand free. The absence of her touch felt like a loss, a wound deeper than any silver blade. She stepped back, retreating into the shadows, leaving him wanting. "Rest, Wolf," she whispered, turning toward the door. "Tomorrow, you will need your strength." And then she was gone. Ronan let out a slow, shuddering breath, his body tight with frustration, his mind a storm of conflicting instincts. She was dangerous. He was doomed. And yet, he knew this was only the beginning. Ronan was awake long before she entered the room. He had sensed her before the door even creaked, the cold shift in the air, the delicate trace of her scent, the unnatural stillness that belonged only to creatures of the dark. And yet, when she stepped inside, it still hit him like a strike to the chest. Celine moved like mist, silent, effortless. The black of her gown melted into the candlelit shadows, the silver of her eyes gleaming like moonlight on water. A specter, a temptation, a warning. She had come to him every night since he woke, and every night he felt the noose tightening around them both. Tonight, he wouldn't let her leave so easily. "You're still here," she murmured, stopping just within reach. His smirk was slow, edged with something dark. "And yet, I don't see the guards storming in to kill me. Should I assume you're growing fond of keeping a wolf in your chambers?" Her lips curved, not quite a smile, more like a shadow of one. "I told you. I don't know why I saved you." "Liar." Celine tilted her head, amused but unreadable. "You assume too much. And you assume I don't know what hunger looks like," he growled, stepping forward. She didn't move back. She never did. He had spent enough time watching her, sensing her, unraveling the quiet secrets beneath her unshaken composure. He could hear the way her breath changed. Not quite fear, not quite desire, but something dangerous, something unspoken. He could smell it. A predator's instinct, a curse and a gift. His body burned with it. She lifted a single hand, fingers hovering just above his chest. Not touching, not yet. Her eyes flickered downward, lingering on the scars, the wounds barely healed. Wounds she had tended. A slow breath escaped her lips. "You need blood." His jaw tightened. The word itself sent a pulse of raw, primal need through him. "I need a lot of things," he muttered. She didn't pull away, didn't break his gaze. And that was when he knew. She had already made her decision. She was going to give it to him. His breathing turned shallow as she raised her wrist to her own lips. Without hesitation, she bit down. Ronan watched, mesmerized, as a thin line of ruby red welled against her ivory skin. The scent hit him instantly. Rich, powerful, forbidden. His vision darkened. His muscles tensed. She held her wrist out to him, silent, waiting. A vampire's blood. A death sentence for a werewolf. Yet all he could think about was her pulse beneath the surface, the power laced within every drop, the way her eyes never left his even as she made herself vulnerable to him. His fingers wrapped around her wrist. Slowly, carefully. A warning, a promise. She didn't resist, didn't tremble. She trusted him. He brought her wrist to his lips. The first taste was fire. Ronan groaned low in his throat, his grip tightening around her delicate arm as the rush of power, warmth, something unknown and ancient slammed into his veins. His body burned, a fever spreading from the inside out. Not poison, not pain, something else, something worse, something binding. His breath turned ragged, his vision sharpened, his pulse thundered in his ears. Celine's other hand found his chest, steadying him, as if she could feel what was happening to him. And he could feel her. Not just her skin, not just her heartbeat, but her soul, her darkness, her hunger. His lips left her wrist, but he didn't let go. His forehead rested against hers, breaths mingling, tension curling tight between them like an unbreakable chain. "You shouldn't have done that," he rasped. Celine exhaled slowly, silver eyes heavy-lidded. "I know." Their fate had just been sealed. And there was no turning back. Ronan had tasted death before. But this was something else entirely. Celine's blood coursed through his veins, igniting something dark, something primal. His wombs knit together with unnatural speed, his muscles surging with newfound strength. He clenched his fists, feeling the raw power vibrating beneath his skin. Not just werewolf, not just beast, something more, something unchained. And all because of her. Celine stood before him, watching, waiting. He could still taste her on his tongue. Rich, forbidden, intoxicating. It wasn't just blood. It was her essence, her power, her very being woven into his. A bond that should not exist. A bond that could never be undone. His gaze snapped to hers, wild and sharp. "Do you know what you've done?" Her expression remained unreadable, but her breath had quickened. "I saved you." He stepped closer, predatory, imposing. "You bound us." Her silver eyes flickered, not with fear, never with fear, but something deeper, something dangerous. "I know," she whispered. A growl rumbled deep in his chest. "You should have let me die." She lifted her chin, unwavering. "You wouldn't have let me." He exhaled sharply. Damn her. Damn this. He should be furious, should be planning his escape, should be tearing this cursed place apart brick by brick. Instead, all he could focus on was the way she stood before him, fragile in appearance, yet completely untouchable, cold as moonlight, yet burning into him like a brand. His fingers twitched at his sides. He ached to grab her, to shake her, to pull her closer, to see if she would shatter or burn him alive. Celine's lips parted slightly, as if she could hear the war raging inside him. Then, before he could stop himself, he reached out. His hand caught her jaw, tilting her face up to his. Her skin was cold, ice against the heat of his palm, but she did not pull away. She let him touch her. "You don't understand what this means," he murmured, voice rough. She did not blink. "Tell me." His grip tightened, his thumb brushing along the sharp edge of her cheekbone. Delicate, lethal. His heartbeat thundered in his chest, but hers was silent. "You are mine now," he said darkly, "as much as I am yours." For the first time, something flickered in her expression. Not fear, not regret. Something else. Something that should not exist between their kinds. "And yet," she breathed, voice like velvet, "you are still in chains." The words snapped through the haze in his mind. His jaw clenched, his grip loosening just enough for her to step back. Cold rushed between them. The loss of contact was like a blade to his ribs. She turned, her gown flowing like liquid night. "They'll come for you soon." Ronan's instincts bristled. "Who?" She didn't answer. Instead, she reached the heavy iron door and placed a single pale hand against it. A queen in her own prison. A wraith in the dark. His pulse pounded. "You saved me." His voice was low, rough. "Are you planning to let them kill me now?" Celine paused. A breath. A hesitation. Then she looked back over her shoulder, silver eyes unreadable. "No," she murmured. "I think I'd rather watch you fight." And then she was gone, leaving behind only the ghost of her scent and the curse of her blood burning through his body. Ronan exhaled slowly. He had been right about her from the start. She was going to ruin him, and he was going to let her. Ronan felt the shift in the air long before the first boot struck the stone floor outside his cell. They were coming. The scent of iron and death thickened as footsteps approached, many of them. The vampires were cautious, disciplined, but he could still hear the way their heartbeats did not exist. The door groaned open. Light slashed through the dark, and then they stepped inside. 5. No, 6. Armed with silver. Ice cold and empty. A test. A warning. A death sentence. Ronan smirked. They didn't know what Celine had done. They didn't know he was no longer just a werewolf. The first one lunged, blade flashing in the dim torchlight. Too slow. Ronan moved, his body nothing but pure, untamed instinct. He caught the vampire's wrist mid-strike, twisting until the snap of bone cut through the air like a gunshot. A strangled cry followed, but Ronan had already turned, driving his elbow into another attacker's throat. Chaos erupted. They swarmed him, weapons slashing, aiming for vital points. But Ronan was faster now, stronger, his senses sharpened, his body thrumming with the unnatural force of her blood. A blade sliced across his ribs, burning, but healing just as quickly. Another attacker dove at him, fangs bared. Ronan grabbed him mid-air and slammed him into the stone wall with a sickening crack. A growl rumbled deep in his chest, low and menacing. The remaining vampires hesitated, fear flashing in their dead eyes. They knew now. He wasn't just a werewolf anymore. Ronan exhaled, slow and controlled, as the last two backed away. Not so eager now, are you? The door behind them creaked. And then she stepped through. Celine, a vision in black, her gown rippling like shadows, silver eyes sharp and unreadable. Untouched by the violence. Unbothered by the bodies on the floor. The guard stiffened. My lady, he. She lifted a single hand. They silenced instantly. Ronan wiped blood from his jaw, watching her, waiting. You didn't have to kill them, she murmured, stepping forward. His smirk was slow, dark. They didn't give me much choice. Celine's gaze flickered over the bodies, calculating. Cold. But when her eyes returned to his, something else lingered there. Something only he could see. She had known this would happen. She had wanted this to happen. Ronan stepped toward her. The vampires flinched. But Celine did not. She remained still, composed. A porcelain goddess in a room full of ruin. He stopped just before her, his towering frame swallowing the space between them. How much of this was your plan? Her lashes lowered slightly. What do you mean? His fingers itched to grab her, to shake the truth out of her, to claim what was now his. You didn't stop them from coming, he murmured, voice rough. You didn't warn me. You wanted to see what I would do. A pause. Then she smiled. A slow, knowing curve of her lips. His breath turned sharp. Celine reached up, so lightly, so effortlessly, and brushed the edge of his jaw. A feather-light touch, a deadly promise. I needed to know, she whispered, her voice sliding over his skin like silk. If you were worthy. Ronan's blood roared. Not from rage. From something worse. From the undeniable, inescapable truth that he belonged to her now. Not because of the blood bond. Not because of what she had done. But because he wanted to. Because he would burn the world down as she asked him to. Celine's fingers lingered for only a moment before she turned away, the ghosts of her touch branding him more than fire ever could. Come, wolf, she murmured as she walked toward the door. And like a storm pulled by the tide, Ronan followed. Ronan followed her. Not because she commanded him, not because the blood bond twisted through his veins like a curse. He followed because he wanted to. Celine glided ahead of him, leading him through the labyrinthine corridors of the vampire stronghold. The torches cast flickering shadows across the stone walls, their flames unable to warm the air that seemed to bend around her. She was stillness and chaos, fragility and danger, a goddess wrapped in midnight. And Ronan, a beast of war, a creature of instinct, a predator made to tear and conquer. Was utterly, mercilessly caught in her gravity. He could still feel the ghost of her touch on his jaw, could still hear her whisper, if you were worthy. He should have hated her for that. He should have torn her apart for testing him. But instead, he burned for her. Celine stopped at the end of the corridor, where an arched doorway led into a vast open chamber. The ceiling stretched high, carved with ancient symbols that pulsed with a faint, eerie glow. A single throne sat at the far end, dark and regal, framed by heavy drapes that swayed with the night's breath. She turned to face him, the movement slow, deliberate, like a queen meeting the wolf at her gates. You're stronger now, she murmured. I can feel it. Ronan smirked. You would know, wouldn't you? A flicker of amusement crossed her face. Yes. He stepped forward, his presence filling the space between them. So tell me, Celine, why go through all of this? Why save me, test me, push me? She didn't answer at first. Instead, she reached up, fingers costing over the fabric of her gown, over the place where her heart should have been beating. I have never met a creature like you before, she admitted softly. I have never felt something I could not control. Roman's eyes darkened. Something inside him, something primal, something monstrous, awakened. You're afraid of it. His voice was low, rough. She didn't deny it. Celine had survived for centuries without fear. without weakness, without the tangled mess of want. But here they stood, drawn together by something forbidden, unnatural, unstoppable. Ronan stepped closer, too close, close enough to see the way her lips parted, the way her lashes trembled ever so slightly. "You should be afraid," he murmured, "because I don't know how to stop." She exhaled, slow and steady. "Neither do I." The words were a surrender and a challenge all at once. Ronan growled low in his throat, a sound of possession, of warning. The space between them burned, heavy with something neither could name. Celine lifted a hand, tracing the collar of his torn shirt, the scars beneath. "Your kind was made for war," she whispered. His fingers found her wrist, wrapping around it firm, unyielding, claiming. "And yours was made for ruin." She smiled then, dark, knowing. "And yet here we are." His grip tightened, just enough to feel the delicate bones beneath her cold skin. His body thrummed with the urge to pull her closer, to shatter the fragile restraint between them. Instead, she leaned in, not breaking his grip, not flinching, only yielding enough to drive him mad. "You crave it, don't you?" she whispered against his jaw. "The hunger, the power, the bond." His breath was ragged. Yes, he craved her. Celine's lips brushed his skin, a whisper of contact that seared through him like fire. "Then come, wolf," she murmured. "Let's set the world ablaze." And Ronan, lost in the storm of her, let himself burn. Ronan had never been a man of hesitation. Instinct ruled him, the thrill of the hunt, the pulse of battle, the promise of conquest. He took what he wanted, fought for what was his, and never bowed to anything that bled. But Celine did not bleed. She was ice and shadow, beauty that did not fade, a creature untouched by time. And yet, standing before him now, with silver eyes darkened and breath unsteady, she was more alive than anything he had ever known. His grip on her wrist remained firm, possessive, unyielding. But she did not pull away. She only tilted her head slightly, like a queen considering her conqueror. "You're playing a dangerous game, Celine." His voice was low, edged with a growl. She smiled, that slow, knowing curve of her lips that drove him mad. "So are you." His jaw clenched. Damn her. He could still feel the phantom touch of her lips at his jaw, the way her voice had curled around him like silk. He had spent his life resisting chains, tearing through anything that tried to hold him down. And now he was bound by something he could not break. Celine stepped forward, pressing herself just close enough that he could feel the unnatural coolness of her skin against his burning heat. His pulse pounded. She was testing him. Again, pushing him to see how far he would go before he lost control. But this time, he wasn't the one being hunted. He was the hunt. With a growl, he moved, fast, brutal, without mercy. In a single motion, he had her pinned against the stone wall, his hands braced beside her, caging her in. She inhaled sharply, but not from fear. No, Celine did not fear him. She wanted this. "You think you hold the power here," he murmured, his breath brushing against her ear. "You think you can keep testing me and walk away untouched." Her silver gaze flickered with something dark and wicked. "I think," she whispered, "that you like it." His hand moved. Instinct, hunger, need, trailing over the curve of her throat, feeling the steady stillness beneath his fingers. No heartbeat, no warmth. And yet, her body told a different story. Her lips parted slightly, the barest of breaths escaping. His control snapped. Ronan seized her. Not gently, not carefully. With fire, with fury, with the kind of hunger that could not be denied. Celine gasped, her fingers curling against his chest, her sharp nails digging in, not to push him away, but to pull him closer. The world outside this moment did not exist. Not the war between their kinds, not the inevitability of bloodshed. Just this, just them, bound by something neither of them could escape, something neither of them wanted to escape. She tilted her head, fangs flashing in the dim light. "What happens now, Wolf?" Ronan smirked, his voice dark, promising. "We burn." And then, the doors crashed open. The moment shattered. Celine's eyes flicked toward the intruders, dark figures moving in the torchlight, weapons drawn, the scent of silver and blood thickening the air. Ronan snarled, already shifting, already preparing to rip them apart. But Celine grabbed his wrist, stopping him. For the first time, he saw something in her gaze that had never been there before. Fear. Not for herself. For him. And that was how he knew. Whatever was coming next would change everything. Ronan reacted on instinct. The scent of silver and death filled the chamber, the intruders moving in with practiced precision. Assassins, warriors, executioners. They were here for blood. His blood. Celine's grip on his wrist was strong, but not strong enough to hold him back. Not now. Not when they had come to take what was his. A snarl tore through his throat as he lunged forward. Fangs. Claws. Fury. The first attacker barely had time to react before Ronan's hand closed around his throat. A sickening crack, a body dropping lifeless to the ground. The others did not hesitate. Blades flashed. Silver, meant to burn, to kill, to break. But Ronan was faster, stronger, something more than just a werewolf now. He became the storm. He moved through them with savage precision, dodging a blade aimed for his ribs, twisting, breaking, tearing. They had come prepared for a beast, but they had not come prepared for him. Celine moved beside him, fluid and lethal, her gown a swirl of black silk as she danced through the chaos. Fangs glinting, eyes alight with something dangerous. She struck like a shadow, her fingers sinking into the chest of one of the assassins. His scream cut short as she crushed his heart in her palm. More figures flooded into the room. Too many, even for them. Ronan growled, shoulders rising and falling with ragged breaths, blood dripping from his hands. His wounds burned, slow to heal under the taint of silver. Celine stood beside him, her expression unreadable. He turned to her. "You knew this was coming." She didn't deny it. His chest heaved. Betrayal, rage, desire, a dangerous mix. Why? The word was a growl, edged with something darker than fury. Celine's silver eyes held his, and for the first time, he saw something beneath her usual cold exterior. A war, a choice, a sacrifice. "They were always going to come for you, Ronan," she said, voice steady, but soft. "I could not stop them." His hands curled into fists. "But you didn't warn me. I had to know." She hesitated, her gaze flickering to his bloodied knuckles, to the wreckage of bodies at his feet. "I had to know what you would become." The air cracked between them. Ronan moved, faster than he should have, faster than she expected. One step, then another, until she was against the stone wall, his body caging hers in. Her breath hitched, not from fear, never from fear. She had tested him. She had pushed him. She had betrayed him. And still, he wanted her. Still, she wanted him. His hand slammed against the wall beside her, his chest rising and falling in deep, ragged breaths. "Did I pass?" His voice was low, rough, filled with something raw and undeniable. Celine tilted her chin, her lips parting as if she meant to answer. But the words never came. A sharp whistle sliced through the air. Pain, sudden, searing, brutal. Ronan grunted, staggering back. A silver bolt jutted from his side, burning like fire beneath his ribs. Poisoned. Lethal. Celine's eyes widened. No. Another whistle. Another bolt. This one through his shoulder. He hit the ground on one knee, vision blurring, his body rejecting the poison and failing to keep up. Celine was suddenly in front of him, hands on his face. Cold. Soft. Desperate. "Ronan," she breathed, her voice like a song he wanted to hold on to. "Stay with me." His grip tightened on her wrist. "Don't. Run." A shadow moved behind her. A final strike. A dagger aimed for her heart. She didn't see it, but he did. With everything left in him, he moved. A growl. A blur of motion. Pain, again. But this time, it didn't matter. He tore the assassin apart, silver slicing through his own flesh in the process. And then, silence. The fight was over. The bodies lay still. Ronan swayed, his vision darkening. Celine caught him before he fell, lowering him to the cold stone floor, her fingers pressing against his wounds. She whispered something, ancient, powerful, forbidden. But even as darkness took him, he still felt her. The last thing he saw was her silver gaze locked onto his, filled with something she had never let him see before. Fear, regret, devotion. And then all was black.